Hey there, Nick here. In this video, we're going to go over some patterns with environment variables to make your web applications a little bit more resilient to human error, especially around forgetting to set environment variables. So we're going to go over things like differentiating required versus optional environment variables. And we're also going to go over some patterns with Flask and Rails. And by the way, these example applications are up on GitHub. I'll link to them in the description. I also have examples for Django, Node, and Phoenix as well. And all the patterns that we're going to go over in this video, even though we're only going to look at Flask and Rails real quick here in the video and kind of go over some Python and Ruby examples, they all apply to Node and Elixir as well. So you'll have examples for all those. And if you're using something else like PHP, well, guess what? The patterns are going to work there as well because we're not doing anything too crazy here. So I am running the Flask application here. And, the patterns that we're going to go over here are differentiating required versus optional. But the second piece of the puzzle is ensuring that you only read your environment variables in a config file that is read when your application starts up. So with Flask here, if I open up my app.py file here, and with Rails, by the way, it's even easier. For example, anything in your config directory that is going to be read when your app starts up. So with Flask, though, real fast, I am reading in this config settings file here, which is in the sidebar here, settings. All of my environment variables are in here or in Gunicorn. This is the web server, the application server that we're running. If there's something missing here, this is going to be caught immediately when it starts up. But the idea here is I have this one config file. All my environment variables are being referenced, and we're going to go over the differentiation between required and optional in a minute here. But the good news now is in my Flask application, if I want to reference something like the server name or a Redis URL, I am never going to reach in, like somewhere deep into my application's code and access this environment variable. No, I am going to import this settings file and read from this. So this way, my application is only ever reading from the config file. And the application never even needs to think about environment variables. It only cares about config files and whether or not the config options are loaded from an environment variable, or it's something like this where it's hard-coded not to an environment variable, then it's all the same from the application's point of view. And what's really great about this, though, is since this config file is read once when the application is booted up here, well, if there's a required environment variable that's missing, then as soon as the application boots up, it is going to throw a key error. In this case with Python, the application will fail to start, and I'll be immediately notified if something went wrong. Now, the alternative to this one is, let's say you have some environment variable commands like this floating around deep in your application. Well, let's say it's on some like a terms of service page or some page that a user might not go to all the time. You may deploy your application expecting a required environment variable to be set, but then, 2 hours, 2 days, 2 weeks, 2 months down the line, you get an exception because the user, hit that page then and there, and that's when the check is going to happen. And by then it's way too late. So what's really nice though about this to reduce human error and make things a little bit more resilient is, if you're deploying your application to production, you may require that your application passes some health checks before it goes live. So the idea here is your application tries to boot up and some health checks are run. I've done videos about that in the past. I'll leave some cards up for those. But yeah, if that health check is good, then your app can go live. If that health check fails, then the old version of your app can continue to run and the new version just won't go up. You'll get the error. And the idea there is you have no downtime and you just were protected by this little neat trick here to, make sure that everything is defined how it should be. So I am running this application in the background here. It is running Docker here. There's the example application. But let's see real quick here what happens if I try to start this application with an environment variable that I have marked as required. So in this case with Flask, we have the secret key environment variable. Rails and other frameworks have very similar ones where, this key is used to help sign sessions and other things like that. It's a secret that only your server has, and it should be a random value. It should never be shared with anyone. And, insecure key for dev is literally just for development. But you can see here, I commented out the secure key or secret key. So let me try to start up the Flask application and we will see what happens. So everything is starting to start and then it fails immediately and everything exits. Why? Because we got a key error. It says that secret key needs to be defined here. I tried to read os.environment on the secret key. It didn't exist. We got the exception from Python. Application failed to start. If I had some health check over here, it would fail because, the app is no longer running. It's hanging forever now. Why? Because it's not running. So yeah, nice. And with Rails, honestly, it's a little bit even easier. So, well, not even easier, but not too much involved here. So with Rails, you have a config directory, and we're not going to spend a huge amount of time even looking at some Rails code right now. But yeah, if you put all of your environment variables in the config directory, whether or not it's in an initializer or environment specific file or application RB or your Puma file or whatever, then you're going to get that protection to where these values are going to be read when your app boots up. You'll get the same protection as Flask here with the app factory pattern, and you'll be good to go here. Nice. Now, I'm not going to go over all the examples for Django, etc., but all the example apps that are up on GitHub are set up and ready to work like this. So that's basically how that works. So now let's go over a couple of examples of just like seeing the difference between required and optional. So if I go to the settings.py file here, and I'm actually going to unwind this too, we'll run some Docker commands manually unrelated to these example apps here. But, I kind of like to start with practical examples first, and then we can kind of, maybe go into the details and see how it actually works here. But with Python specifically, and this applies to Flask, Django, whatever Python web framework you might be using, the difference between required and optional is you can use os.environ with the square brackets here, and if this key is not available, then we get the error that we just saw, right? When we didn't define that secret key, Python threw a key error when it tried to execute this line. So the idea here is, this is the syntax you could use if it's required. And if you are dealing with an optional environment variable, then the syntax you can use os.getEnv instead. For example, this is a function call here. You can put in the key name that you're trying to read. And if the key name doesn't exist, then it is going to fall back and use this default. However, if the key does exist, like let's say you have this defined in your env file, or it's made available to your application in some way, then it is going to use the value that you pass in. So, it's optional in the sense that, hey, if it's not there, I'm going to fall back and use that. Otherwise, I am going to use the value that you pass in. And in this case, no exception is going to be thrown if the key doesn't exist. Why? Because there's the default value. Now, you may have also seen this in the past where you can do, getEnv like this, and you just have the key here. So in this case, if this were to execute, then this is the same as this. So it is setting a default value of none. So, in Ruby's world, that would be nil, or null in other languages. But yeah, it's basically none. But I am not really a huge fan of that pattern in the sense that, I don't know, if the thing is optional and is defaulting to none, then I don't know, does it need to be an environment variable? Why is it optional? Maybe it needs to be required and should do something. So I don't know. In that case, I very rarely just set none as a default value for optional there. I like to be a little bit more explicit in my intent of, is it required or optional? And if it's required, then yeah, I use this syntax here. So let's pop open a shell here and just play with this a little bit. I'm going to do this using Docker, but again, if you just have Python directly installed in your box, that's completely fine. I am really just running this Python command here, importing OS, running os.environ, and this environment variable name happens to not exist in this Docker environment here. I'm just using the official Python image 3, by the way. Normally I like to go down to the patch release 3.11.4, but if you watch a video in the future, you'll get a more modern version of Python here using Bullseye Slim here or whatever, not important, but we can see here that we do get the key error name. Why? Because in this Docker environment, then that environment variable doesn't exist, and we can confirm that. We can run the env command here, and these are all the environment variables that are available to this container that we just spun up and ran here. And we can see name is not in there, so that's why we get the key error. So let me go and rerun this command here with a slightly little different syntax. And we're going to do the os.getEnv example here. So you can see now I'm printing out os.getEnv name, but we're setting a default here. If name isn't available, which is not, it's going to fall back and use nobody as the name there. Done. Cool. So now let's do one more example here. Make sure, yeah, it's still on screen. Let me copy the other commands here that I have off camera, paste that in. Cool. And then we're going to run this one, and it says Nick. Why? Because in this case, subtle difference here now, I did modify the command, the Docker command, to include passing in the environment variable name equals Nick. If you have a different name, put in a different name. It's going to output your name over here. Why? Because it's using getEnv and then looking for name. It exists in this case. It's not going to use the default. Instead, it's going to use what you have here. So that's it. So with Python, you have pretty good setup here, right? If you're going to be required, done like this, and optional, you would do that. Great. So now let's take a look here a little bit at using Ruby instead of Python here. I'm just going to go over running the raw commands here that we just went over for Python, but we'll do them for Ruby instead here. And in this case, I'm just running the official Ruby image, also version 3 at the point of making this video, also running Debian Slim here. But yeah, so In this case, we're using puts, which is a different syntax for print in Ruby. And then what are we doing here? Well, Ruby has env here, and you can do .fetch. And if you do .fetch and you pop in the name that you want and it doesn't exist, then you also get a key error back, just like Python. Very similar to os.getEnviron with the square brackets. And then we can do another variant of this one, which is also using env.fetch and also, the name there. But in this case, we're going to pop in a default value. So fetch will work differently if you decide to pop in a default value, because if you do, then it becomes optional and now it's going to use that. And then also, just like the other example with Python, we can throw it in like this, where, we do pass in the name environment variable here, and then we get that back. And then we do env.fetch name, and then nobody. And also with Ruby, more details, of course, but you don't need to use a function parameter as a default value. You can also pass in a block. It is only going to execute when the default triggers. So it's kind of an interesting pattern, but way beyond the scope of this video. But you may have also seen with Ruby other syntaxes as well, where you can do, let me go back to this one here, where you can just do env, right? And then you can do name like this. And this is totally fine for an optional one. Like in this case, it's not going to print anything. This will return nil. So if we would actually run IRB, like the interactive terminal here, and we would do, I need to use IT for interactive, right? TTY set up, whatever. Yep. So if I do name here like this, then we can see we get back nil. And I think Ruby version might be an environment variable that's available. Yeah, we can see 3.22 there. Because if I rerun this in env, we're going to see Ruby version here. Cool. So I don't know. I'm not a huge fan of using the square bracket syntax with Ruby because, again, if I want to have a required environment variable, I'm going to go with using fetch here with no default. And if I want an optional one, then yeah, I'm going to set the value here. I really don't see too many reasons for using the square bracket one. I mean, syntactically, it's a little bit less typing, and you could theoretically use it as an optional environment variable. Like if you're cool with nil being the value of what this is when it's not set. And I mean, you can do the same thing with env.fetch. Like you can put nil here instead of a string nobody, and it will default to nil there. Yeah, I mean, I guess in that case, like you could use that. But yeah, I kind of like to be consistent here and just use env.fetch. And I guess before we wrap this up, and because that's kind of basically it, there is one more kind of fun example to go over because it does demonstrate a use case that we haven't really seen yet here. So if we go to, I think it's my node example. Well, it definitely is a node example. But if I go to config index, yeah. So node works slightly different in the sense that, you can use process.env and then the key that you want to read here. And if you want to set a default value there, you can just be like, oh yeah, like if the port is not defined, then let's full back to 8000. By the way, that's a good example of just like an optional environment variable in any language. But as far as I know, Node does not have a way to, throw an error, like a key error, if a environment variable doesn't exist. Because if you just did this like that, then this port is just going to be undefined, and undefined, it doesn't throw an exception like when the application starts up. So what I did here was, I just created my own little function here. I named it process env required. Why? Because it matches like the naming conventions here, like, process env, but now it's like, well, this is process env required. And what this function does here, you just pass in the key that you want that's going to be required. It will try to get the value of that key. At this point in time, though, value could be undefined. Maybe it's null. Maybe you put in an empty string. If that happens, then we're just going to throw generic error here, basically labeling it key error. And then, you get a message back saying that key error not found. Otherwise, if you do have a value, then you're good to go, and we get that as the return value of the function, and then it's set over here. So, this little couple line function here gives you a way to differentiate required and optional in languages like Node. And I don't know enough about PHP offhand. I don't know if PHP has a way to do it like Ruby and Python does, like built into the language itself. But if not, then you can make a very similar type of function for PHP. And, with the Elixir set up too, not going to even bother looking at it on video, but it follows suite with Python and Ruby in that, you have two separate functions that you can run, like fetch env bang for required and get env, I think on system for both of those, I think. But yeah, anyways, like they're in the example app for the Phoenix one that's up on GitHub. So I'll link to that one in the description. But yeah, let me know in the comments below. Are you using this pattern? I do think it's worth it only because, yeah, more resiliency, less human error. I like the intent of being like, if I see that, I know that it's required. So yeah, if you liked the video, please give it a thumbs up because it really does help a lot. Thanks a lot for watching, and I will see you in the next one.